If I listen to the loudest people on the internet, I might really be the only person that likes Senua's Saga. I actually liked it quite a bit. There obviously needs to be some context added, but that's what we're here for. So do I think the gripes about the game are overblown, or did they just not bother me as much as everyone who hates it? Well, let's get into it. Welcome back to JBG. Today we're talking about Senua's Saga Hellblade 2 on the Series X. Senua's Saga is a sequel to Senua's Sacrifice that came out in 2017 from developer Ninja Theory. Let's put that first bit of context right here. I bounced off the first Hellblade after about 3 or 4 hours back when it came out. I honestly hated the environmental alignment puzzles that seemed to come up every 20 minutes. I also didn't even appreciate these kinds of games back then, and I fully expected to bounce right off this one when I downloaded it. But my Series X has mostly been used for older games to this point, so I decided to give this game a shot. And I'm absolutely glad I did. And I'll also say right here that I've already downloaded the first one again, just to give it another day in court, in between the 5 other games I'm trying to get through right now. So there's completely a possibility that I'll put out a video on that one that retracts some of the things I say here. But it can't change the fact that I enjoyed almost my entire playtime of Hellblade 2. Let's cover some of the basics, and I'll go into some of the common gripes. And then most importantly, what I would really recommend as a price point to anyone considering this game that doesn't have Game Pass. As usual, I'm going to try and keep spoilers to a minimum, but due to the length of the game and how it's set up, there's going to be a few mild spoilers in here. I'm going to try and keep as much of the late game footage out of context as possible, but there will be some set pieces shown without going too deep into the surrounding narrative. So the story opens up with Senua on a slave ship of the same Northmen that attacked her village to set the narrative off in the first game. She intentionally allowed herself to be captured so she could find the source of the Northmen coming to her lands and enslaving her people. The ship wrecks before it hits land, and she ends up finding and capturing the slave master from the ship and using him as a guide to find the village sending their people to her lands. Her focus shifts and goes in a direction I didn't expect at all. But here's where one of the gripes sneak in already. I don't want to explain much more than this because of the well-known lack of runtime here. Another thing we'll come back to in a minute. Mechanically, it's very similar to the first one. Essentially, both these games are walking simulators with some added combat sections. You have a couple different environmental puzzles here than the same old alignment to see runes, and I did find the rune puzzles much less finicky in this one than the ones that drove me crazy in the first one. Here they dialed those back quite a bit and implemented a couple others that manipulate the terrain to access different sections and faces hidden in rocks that'll open new paths when focused on. The combat sections here are pretty simple. They're slow combat mechanics. And admittedly, there isn't really any depth to it. Light and heavy attacks, simple dodge, a block that can parry with good timing, and a slow time mechanic that's charge-based. Even being more simplified than the first game, with only single enemies ever attacking, I still found how gritty and visceral the combat is to be pretty satisfying. The combat wasn't exactly deep in the first, and I think the classification of both of these games as action-adventure gives the wrong impression entirely. Combat is essentially just another puzzle to break up monotony of the expedition dumps during walking sections. The entire game isn't much different than what would be called a walking sim with a few exceptions, primarily just including combat to begin with. Think of games like Deliver Us the Moon, What Remains of Edith Finch, and Firewatch. These are all games that you could boil down to just pushing up on the thumbstick, those with absolutely zero focus on combat. I think this context is extremely important for a game like this. I've heard a bunch of people acknowledge it, and then immediately it becomes one of their gripes. In no way would I classify either Hellblade game as action-adventure over walking sim. I want to come back really quick during edit, since I started playing Hellblade 1 again, and I want to make a couple quick notes on what I initially thought. The puzzles aren't quite as finicky as I found them in 2017, so I do think it was more of a situation where I just didn't appreciate the kind of games these are back then. And just a quick note on the combat, I still don't at all consider either of these action-adventure games. But I will admit the combat was much more at the forefront of the first one, just playing through the first hour or so. It has much less weight to it, but it's faster and more fluid. I guess kind of the trade-off between the two. But I'll save the rest of that for whenever I finish the first one. Before diving into those gripes, let's hit the achievement front really quick. But first, my shameless plug. This video is sponsored by my day job. All views and opinions are my own. Likes and subs are appreciated, but don't hit the notification button. Does anybody actually even do that? Seems annoying. Don't do that. This is a pretty simple 100% just like the first one. It mainly comes down to the story-related achievements, and then some collectibles. This is one for a change that I would actually recommend a guide, even on a first run if you kept it just to the collectibles. It won't really ruin any of the narrative at all, and it'll still let you figure out the environmental puzzles on your own. Those definitely are easy enough for the average person. You won't need a guide to figure out any of those. It would also let you get your 100% on a single run without having to worry about a second run if you really weren't interested in a second playthrough. That's going to differ depending on where you land with this one, especially if comparing to the first. So into the gripes. The first of the common gripes I hear is the combat changes. Ninja Theory kind of shot themselves in the foot on this one because of how they talked about it and made it sound like they were expanding on the first game. In reality, they simplified an already simple combat system. Enemies no longer attack at the same time, so there's no need to pay attention to anything except the immediate enemy in front of you. This is a complete legit gripe. It's also one I don't personally have. To me, the combat it's extremely simple, but it's also weighty and satisfying. I just look at it as a separate puzzle mechanic to break up the narrative a bit. But when the company talks about how they're expanding the mechanics from the first, trying to make it more immersive and make it feel like a struggle every battle, this is a total miss. Initially, it comes off as a struggle, kind of the same way the threat of the darkness taking over Senua was really just a false mechanic in the first one, just to make it feel like there was more on the line than there really was. I was constantly getting knocked down in combat, but I didn't see a death reload screen until the very end. So even when I don't have an issue with it myself, and really did find the waiting satisfying, I can completely see people having an issue with this, especially because of how it was framed from Ninja Theory. The second gripe really being the story, and how the voices in Senua's head are used compared to the first one. I honestly love this story, but I'll admit because of the first game, there wasn't really a great way to integrate Senua's psychosis and have the same effect here, specifically because of the first game. She's no longer fighting the voices. She accepted them at the end of Senua's sacrifice. I don't think it would have worked without rehashing the same storyline. And I liked how this one didn't just retell the same story of acceptance. It also ended up going left field from where it started from, and I can completely appreciate that. Some people took issue with how the story didn't feel as personal, and I can see that. But to me, I don't take any issue with this because I was hooked on the story. It had already moved on from the first one. The nature of the story shift also means the psychosis voices don't even come close to the nightmare fuel that they were for me in the first game. I kind of burnt out on horror games a long time ago because they just don't really have the same impact on me. But the use of the voices, they got under my skin pretty good in the first game. It wore off here probably within about the first hour. They also lose their effect in combat. Without having to worry about anybody attacking from 360 degrees, they're of no use. All they're doing is saying the same motivational phrases over and over again. That part didn't bug me through most of the game, but I'll admit it was getting to me at the end when I was fumbling over those last couple fights. Overall, they're still really well done, and I think they fit great with the amazing sound design, but they definitely lost some of the impact out of necessity from the narrative changes. And to what's probably the biggest talking point about this game, above all else, is the runtime. The first game averaged out at about 8 hours for most people, so it wasn't a long game at all either. But the 7.5 hours that this one's currently averaged at? Absolutely not. I normally keep a general hour count, since I don't tend to record a lot at the end of a playthrough. This one I actually stretched out over a couple days after work, and then finished it off on my day off. So I initially thought I was sitting around the 10-ish hour mark. I actually recorded every second of this one, and I ended up with 6.5 hours. I think it would be a stretch to get all the way down to 5 hours like some people are saying, because I had a pretty direct playthrough. Even knowing I usually take longer playing through games than average numbers, I was pretty straight through the main story here. And this ends up being my biggest gripe too. I had a completely solid playthrough performance-wise. The graphics are probably the best we've ever seen, even if they make some weird stylistic choices with filters, and the focal points in some cutscenes are kind of off. I was completely invested in the story, and I didn't even think it ended as abruptly as people claimed. I felt like it was right where it was intended, not like they just cut out the ending. This comes off more as a tech demo because of the playtime than even an average walking sim. And this ties directly into where I would recommend picking this up. I'm not being sarcastic or trying to be a contrarian when I say I really did enjoy the game. I really like the story and where it went. I can admit I'm not as critical on the combat as a lot of people, but I also don't consider either of the Hellblade games action-focused. And I might be back in a month to retract this statement if I can actually get through the first one now, but I actually like this one more than the first one, mainly because of the changes to the puzzles. But the runtime was misrepresented by Ninja Theory here, at a launch price of $50. I don't quite have buyer's remorse, since I had already heard about the runtime, and I did enjoy it enough that I immediately started a second run just because I was curious about the alternate narrative. But I also seem to be the minority here on how much I like the game. Even if someone goes into this with the approach of any other narrative-driven walking sim, $50 just seems insane. If you have Game Pass and are interested, I completely recommend it, But if you're thinking about purchase, I would completely recommend waiting until it hits about $20. I really hate to say that for something I was so hooked on whenever I had time to sit down and play, but I also have to admit that if I, of all people, only had 6.5 hours of playtime, it's completely feasible that every average gamer is going to come in around 6 hours. But oh my fuck. Please somebody let me know down in the comments that I'm not the only person on this planet that actually liked playing through this outside of Ninja Theory themselves. Until next time.
When this heals, I will kill you. Not one.
For that, you'll need to stay alive.
What? Toodaloo, motherfucker.